Welcome to the third in a series of online interviews with Richard Harvey, psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. My name is Rob Meager. I'm an interfaith minister, and I lead a spiritual ministry initiative in Ottawa, Canada called Spiritual Guidance. I've been a student of Richard Harvey's work since 2012. Today's interview will discuss the lecture, Absolute Freedom, the Path of Love, Devotion, and Surrender, Part 2 of 2. This lecture is part of an 8-part lecture series called the Sashti Poorthi Lecture Seminars. And each subsequent interview in this interview series will explore in more detail each one of the lectures in the Sashti Poorthi Lecture Seminars. Today's interview about Absolute Freedom and all the Sashti Poorthi Lecture Seminar manuscripts are contained in an ebook entitled Dharma Sky, which is available through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. Dharma Sky is one of a trilogy of 3 ebooks, each containing 14 lectures, totaling 42 lectures. The second ebook is entitled Mokshadam, and the third ebook is entitled Bodhi Ocean, and is currently in production. Again, all ebooks are available through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. You can also listen to the full recording of each of the lectures in this series online through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/education. I would now like to provide you with some background about Richard Harvey. Richard is a psychospiritual psychotherapist, author, and spiritual teacher. His career spans 37 years, working with individuals, couples, groups, and communities. He trained in humanistic and transpersonal psychologies and psychotherapy, studied meditation in India, and trained in Soto Zen. He's been influenced by Jung, Gurdjieff, Alan Watts, and Joseph Campbell, the ancient Taoists, and the Vedas, predominantly Advaita Vedanta. He has a particular affinity with Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and Ramana Maharshi, and was more recently inspired by Aditya Samaraj and Nisargadatta. Deeper than all of these varied experiences and teachings, however, is the early sense of truth Richard possessed since childhood. A deep understanding and intimacy with the Noumena, the divine source of being. It is from this innate wisdom that his spiritual teaching has blossomed, grown, and developed. Richard is a prolific and passionate author. 2 of his books were self-published efforts, The Book of Being in 1998 and Tao's Gift in 2005. The Flight of Consciousness was published by Ashgrove Publishing in 2002. His latest book, Your Essential Self, The Inner Journey to Authenticity and Spiritual Enlightenment, was published by Llewellyn Worldwide Limited in 2013. Richard has published nearly 200 articles, and he is currently working on his forthcoming book entitled Your Sacred Calling. Richard's lifetime of work and study and experience has culminated in his independent psychospiritual psychotherapy practice from his mountaintop spiritual center, Cortillo Llano de Montarno. The center is set in beautiful and tranquil 3 acres on the southern slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains in Andalusia, Valencia, Spain. From his center, Richard offers individual therapy and couples counseling in person or via Skype to people all over the world, psychospiritual training and supervision, courses, and retreats. Richard Harvey's work connects personality and spirituality through a middle stage of heart awakening, authenticity, and compassion in his comprehensive model of human development, the 3 stages of awakening. He is the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a profound, radical, and fresh approach to the sacred spiritual life and to the dilemmas which have arisen from the accelerated development of ego processes in the 21st century. He believes that it is through the transformation of the individual and his unique struggle to become fully him or herself that we will progress through a collective gestation of soul and spirit into a timely light and expanded consciousness. And it's now my pleasure to welcome and invite Richard Harvey to the call. Hello. Good to see you.
Hi, Rob.
I want to begin today's interview talking a little bit about yoga. And why I'm going to invite that is because early on in the lecture, you talk about the human condition as one of being bound. And at this point, very early on in the lecture, what's binding us is our sense of self, our personality. It's binding us to this life. But then you also include in this introductory section, and I'm quoting here, there is, of course, another binding, and that binding is a welcome one. It is the binding of the religio, the yoke or joining of yoga. And you go on to talk about how you're evoking the etymological roots of 2 familiar words, religion and yoga. And you mentioned that religio comes from the Latin word meaning to go through again, also respect for the sacred, as well as binding or emplacing an obligation. And yoga, you say, is similar. It means yoking or union to join together as one. It's been suggested to me that yoga also implies union with the divine or with God. Have you heard of that? That is, yoga also means and refers to union with the divine or God. And what's been your experience with yoga that makes union with the divine a reality in your life?
As you speak, I was struck by the fact that, it's a given in the life, isn't it, that we attach. See, we attach. It's something you can say about all people, religious, irreligious, pagan, following a individual path. We all attach. It's almost a proof. You don't stand alone. We attach to each other. We attach to the animal around us. We attach to things. We attach to food, of course. But then there's wealth and there's extraneous things that we associate with it. We attach. We attach. We attach. One of the things we know, for the simple reason that the people with the most money are by no means the most happy. One of the things we know is that the strivings for satisfaction through material gain, or having more food, or more partners, or more people we're attached to, doesn't in and of itself feed ultimately something inside. We know that. And the union with the divine then is a given for those of us of a spiritual nature. There's only one thing ultimately that will satisfy, that will feed us. And the curious thing is, there's nothing we have to do to attain it. So this extraordinary process, and we're now in the realms of paradox and contradiction, which I've said before, is the borderline to eternity. You know when you're getting confused. You know when you've entered the realms of paradox and contradiction. This is a very clear indication you're in the symbolic realms and the symbolic border itself between the rational temporal world and the world of eternity, the world of the spirit. Because for a while there, much like tuning a musical instrument, there's a dissonance. So just before you fall into the eternal realms, there is this wavering, and it's a wonderful teaching in Tibetan Buddhism, which is that doubt comes very high up on the spiritual journey hierarchy. Before you spill wholly into enlightenment, according to Tibetan Buddhism, you experience extraordinary doubt. People are always surprised to hear that one about Tibetan Buddhism, because they think you'll overcome possessiveness and jealousy and cynicism and doubt and all these kinds of things, and then sort of move on into the higher realms. But lo and behold, these very ordinary experiences, negative states, are there to kind of grab you just before you go over the wall, so to say. The divine union is the experience, for me personally, of early life, and I know it is. I know I'm by no means the only one, and I know that you can also rekindle or revisit those memories, because many people have forgotten that experience, because this is such an aspiritual, to some degree unloving, or certainly unenlightened period in human evolution. And so those kinds of experiences are often best forgotten because they have no place in your early family life with people who don't begin to understand. I was brought up in such a family. There was nobody there to give any reference points for something that was unspeakable. Then the armouring of personality that I put around myself, which is inevitable in any case, sometimes appeared to me to be spiritual breakthrough or intimations of the divine. But it wasn't. But I wasn't to know that at the time. What it was the extraordinary elation of liberating myself over a period of time, which is wonderful, which is extraordinary, and gives you incredible experiences which you can easily mistake for the spiritual. But the union divine happens outside of time. It happens beyond experience. It's nothing to do with experience.
It's interesting.
And that's something that we don't seem to be getting, although it's been offered us for a very long time. The most elative experiences you have in these temporal realms, in and of themselves, may resemble spiritual experience or enlightenment or divine union, but they can't be. They can't be. It must be beyond that border. It must be over the border.
Away from the ego. You end the introductory section in this lecture with a very interesting statement, and I laughed at it compassionately, with a great deal of respect. I laughed, more of a joyful giggle. And you ended this opening section off with these words: In other words, we are bound to life in order to become enlightened, and in that lies your absolute freedom, your liberation and self-realization, your union with reality itself. And what I began to giggle at was that we are bound to life to become enlightened may be the greatest paradox or joke of our existence. You know, we have to go through this experience to become enlightened. And I just found it perhaps the greatest paradox. And would you agree? If not the greatest, one of the greatest paradoxes.
Yeah, in the in these two lectures, we were talking about absolute freedom, which had come to me like a neon light. I thought, you know, where do we start with this wonderful idea of speaking to people about, you know, the really important things, and it just came absolute freedom. And I thought, well, that's a biggie, okay, you know, and this paradox rests on the fact that we can't help within the world of egocentricity and experience, time and space, and the ordinary realm that we live in here, but to think of freedom in terms of license to some degree. It's very hard to shed this idea, I wake up in the morning, I do what I want to do, or I wake up this morning, I choose to go to work, or I stay in bed, or I throw a sickie, or, you know, I want to be with this person, I don't want to be with that person, I want to be a smoker, or I don't, and all of this dominates your life to an extraordinary degree. And when you work with that outward field, this place where the inside relates to the outside through this veil of self, and you consider, how could freedom possibly be found in, for example, doing what I want to do? That's absurd. It sounds reasonable, but it's ridiculous. Where is it? There's only one other place. So it's inside, and the most direct and potent way to realize true freedom, which is inside, is to take away these choices outside, for the simple reason, more than anything else, that they are so absolutely absorbing, they're so distracting. And when you take them away and you realize that true freedom's inside, and you can do that very effectively by restricting your outside choices, which you can do, or you can have done for you, depending on your strength of will. It will lead you to it, which is quite extraordinary. So when you take, as it were, you block off all the roads out here, so the veil of self has nowhere back in to come. There's a time where you throw a tantrum about it, so to speak, and then when that is calmed down, maybe you throw another couple of tantrums, but when that's finally finished, there is a quiet, and following that quiet, there's this expansiveness, this incredible expansion, which is absolutely real. And I don't know how else you do it but to withdraw. You know, you withdraw. I think it was St. John of the Cross, or is it in the Bhagavad Gita? There's very similar passages about the tortoise withdrawing its head and its claws, you know, and it's used as a metaphor for the five senses, You withdraw your senses, or what I would call your soul connection to the sensual world. This world of the senses, this world of the senses, in which the soul is reflecting, and you move back inside into this darkness. You get younger, because that's where you throw a fit, that's where you have the tantrum, because that's the time where you met the outside world and it didn't conform to your desire.
As influenced by,
and then when you can just get through that, this lovely
driven to
quiet,
get somewhere,
and then this expansive
make something
freedom
out of yourself,
and that's freedom, and you don't find that outside.
And again, the joke about it all is that we needn't do any of that to get to where we want to go. It's to make meaning out of our life. And yet, it's such a challenge. It's still for me, frankly, and I think for most people who walk in this time and space, of this call to, quote, make something out of your life, to do something of meaning, to leave your legacy, leave your imprint on the world. And we need not do any of that to get to where we're trying to get to, other than just sit, literally and figuratively, and just be quiet. And that's really all that needs to be done. And unfortunately, increasingly reminded that that's all we need to do, is just sit and be quiet. What's the wonderful expression? It's the journey of no distance. Mm. Mm-hmm.
It's a journey of no distance. And for many of us, of course, and when we're in it, though, the process of disillusionment, the process of dissatisfaction, the process of letting go of all of it takes us plunging into it, and plunging into it all the way, and exhausting the desire body, so that we actually meet that place where we're convinced. We've followed suffering all the way. The Buddhistic theme, the Buddhistic doctrine, life is suffering, informs me every day. You have to remember or recall that, because it's so easy to lose it when life's joyful, for instance. It's so easy to lose it when you're happy, for instance. Curiously, life is suffering enhances I'm happy. It enhances joy. It doesn't take it away. I know people who would argue against this, but the experience of the spiritual being, I would contend, is to be aware of that suffering. Gives you the other side to happiness, whereas the happiness that pushes away or denies suffering is kind of half of the coin only. Yeah, but I can't remember the name of it. It's one of my favourite stories, and it is a Zen story, which I talk too much Zen stories, but it is, anyway, without knowing the name, it is one of the great Soto Zen patriarchs, and he has become the abbot of the temple. He's now, the main guy. He's in charge, and there is a ceremony ceremony anyway. And somebody says to him, well, this must be wonderful for you because now you're not unhappy anymore, and it's just joy and enlightenment and what have you all the way. And he turns to them and he says, well, now that I am the abbot, now I'm the teacher, now I'm the master here, I've never been filled with more shame, never felt more guilt, I've never felt more misery and unhappiness than being here. And it's a curious story, but you realize that the story it's that one you have when you look to left and right and look around the world and everything's going fine for you in your life.
Later lectures,
and then you see some kids drinking out of a pig's pail or something on the other side of the world. You think, well, how can I be happy when these things are happening in the world still? How can we be
so much of this that plays
in any way complete or satisfied
in spiritual teachings
whilst there's still misery? So this is a wonderful story, I think.
What truth is.
The further you go,
is actually quite opposite.
The more you actually embrace the misery as well as the joy,
to that point.
the happiness and
I'm going to invite that as a foyer
and the shame and the guilt
into a brief, perhaps, discussion about enlightenment, because it's one of those words that is used a lot, perhaps overused, I think sometimes misused. You talk about it shortly after the introductory piece of the lecture. And I was reminded when I read it, it's actually at the beginning of a section that is entitled Student, Disciple, or Devotee. And I want to come back to this idea of the student, devotee, and the disciple. But there's been an interesting saying that I often remind myself of, and this quest for enlightenment, which is often the context in which you hear the word used. And the saying goes like this, and I don't know the source of it, but it says, if you see the illusion, you are enlightened. But if you think you are enlightened, you are part of the illusion. I almost find it a bit of a cone, but I find it incredibly humbling. That's the, even though I know humbleness is of the ego, but if you see the illusion, you're enlightened. But if you think you're enlightened, you're part of the illusion. Does that resonate with you? Do you agree with that? Is that a statement? Is that a sentiment that you relate to?
As a spiritually inclined human being, you pursue enlightenment. You go in search of enlightenment or with an intent toward enlightenment. Everything moves toward that goal. And as you do so, the temporal world appears increasingly illusory. The beings that people the illusory world increasingly see you as nuts because you're chasing something that's invisible. So that's fair enough, because they're in the material mindset. The material, so that makes sense. But the more this illusory world recedes, and with intent you move towards the spiritual or enlightenment or truth or reality, the price of crossing that border I was talking about before appears to you very distinctly, even if you've read it in the ancient scriptures or in modern teachings, and that is the rather unpopular idea that enlightenment is the annihilation of the self, for the simple reason that the self is the source of the illusion in the first place. So everything may appear illusory and may appear to recede, but you see the projector's there even when the thing's being turned off. And then you realize, well, it was you all along. Only you were never separate, and that the suffering of the individual personality and all of this dissatisfaction and all of this striving to achieve that we've just been talking about was merely death throes. I mean, it can be the purpose of your life if you're a materialist, but from a spiritual point of view, it's death throes. It's just restlessness, because none of it in and of itself makes you happy. It doesn't fulfill. So therefore, it's merely death throes, and you can do that for 100,000 lifetimes. It will just be long death throes. As you become close to this border between the illusory and enlightenment, or the unreal and the real, or delusion and the truth, there is an extraordinary price to pay, and that is you can't be enlightened. The individual person cannot be enlightened. My understanding of the present time and the strangeness of the paradox and the contradiction is we can use now this great strength, belief, almost solidity of our individuality, this idea of ourselves. We can take that and we can transform ourselves through that. What I mean by that is we don't have to anymore be in a cult or a world religion or a grouping of some sort. Primarily, we can be here as ourselves in and with our own belief system. There's a few conditions on that, but more or less we can now, for the first time in the human evolution of religious and spiritual endeavor, stand alone with certain conditions, and we can come through, whereas before that was reserved for very serious religious and spiritual people who usually sought, and quite rightly, the extraordinary support of an institution.
Much of the rest of the lecture,
but now we can go through because there is such a proliferation
correct
of
me if I'm
teaching
wrong,
and truth.
but speaks to
But when we get there, and this I think is what
one of the ways,
quote,
if not the primary way, to experience absolute freedom, and that is through the practice of devotion.
Another way of putting it would say you're a conduit for the divine.
You go into a great deal talking
shows
about
through you become
those
transparent
devotional practices.
That's
but
what's
you
going
proceed it by this
you
section,
yourself,
which I found
there is
very
no
interesting. Student, disciple, or devotee.
There is no
and I
enlightened
had a specific question.
I'm not the first person to say that by any means.
Is the student,
but it would be
disciple,
nice
or devotee the same thing?
The truth of that. You pursue enlightenment,
or can one be a student
never
separate
be
from
an
a
individual
disciple, separate from a devotee?
And in this space and time.
Mm-hmm.
No. I think the way in which I intended those words in this lecture and would use them still is, you see, as a teacher you accept people within their capacity as they come, and that's quite regardless of what they say in terms of their aspiration. In other words, someone can aspire to a certain level of practice. It doesn't mean it can necessarily do it. This happens all the time. This happens all the time in therapy and in spiritual teaching and in endeavor. You can't always be where you want to be or even where you see that you could be in time. You've got to be where you are. That's a very strong part of my teaching. Be where you are. Figure it out. It may take you a while, but be where you are. Student is the initial. It's a pupilhood. It's a learning. It could be dilettantism, and it could be some fairly serious kind of PhD study level. So anywhere between the dilettante and the professor, but still learning, still curious, still, shall we say, gathering the information. That's the student. And that's to be respected. There's an initial stage, if you will. The disciple is the one who takes a teacher because the teacher appears. Teacher appears when you're ready. Teacher doesn't appear because you want the teacher to appear. It's what we were talking about before. It's not about your desire or what you want and you don't want. It's about where you really are, and then actually seeing beyond the illusion. And the teacher is I rather like in Ramakrishna's teaching this idea of the whole. The teacher is the hole into the HOLE, a hole, an opening through in. Another way of looking at it is the teacher is the beacon, the light. In time you come to hold on to the teacher. There's nothing else to hold on to. It's the North Star, and you're in the middle of the ocean. There's nothing else. Just know where that star is. So this is discipleship. You're a follower, and that's lovely. There's still an out, of course, because as we know, there's been many disillusioned disciples over time, and people have spoken about their changes of mind, changes of heart, and so on. The devotee, however, is a dimensional leap, I suggest. The devotee, in the way in which I use this third band of spiritual endeavor, retaining his or her ego self, increasingly uses their sadhana or spiritual practice in deference to the teacher or to God.
And with the couple of minutes we have left,
a reflection of God anyway. So the teaching, the teacher, the
many
divine being, you yourself in your individuality, in your own life, are subordinated to that through your devotional practice. This is a higher level. It's what I call third stage awakening. So you now turn the whole thing. And whereas in the first stage awakening it's all about me, of course it is. It's all about me. And in the second stage awakening it's all about heart. What is heart? What is what's love? What really is love?
Now I've found my own
in the third
answer,
stage awakening, the central practice must be the sadhana of relinquishing yourself fully to the divine being. In other words, you surrender to God, and any way in which you're holding back, you still work with the intent toward that. And that's devotional practice. So that's the devotee's work. It's very good. A very good question. It's a very good question. Let me answer in a mundane and a silly way, and then perhaps we can work it up into the seriousness of the question. If you are trying to give up smoking, and if you can't, and if you find through some book or some counselor's method or trick, some way in which you give it up, and then 5 years down the road, you're still talking about how long it is since you gave up the smoking and how it is for you, all in reference to the smoking, then you haven't given up smoking, because smoking isn't just the outward ritual of lighting the thing, put it in your mouth, and taking the smoke into your lungs and so on. It's a dependency issue. It's a cultural issue. It's a familial and relational issue, etc., etc., etc. So if you are still bound to smoking in the inner world, even though you're not buying the things and putting them in your mouth and lighting them up anymore, you haven't let go of anything. You might live a little longer, but you haven't let go of anything. And in a similar way then, working this up into, this is the analogy, if your devotion depends on a sense of sacrifice in the sense that you are a martyr or you are self-consciously being selfless. In other words, look at what I have, look at what I've given, look at what I've let go of, a sort of scourging of yourself, or an ego gratification in your renunciation, you see. Then, of course, that's not the devotee. It may be the misguided disciple, it may even be the student who's a little elevated, but it certainly isn't the devotee, because the devotee enters into the life of devotion much the same way as the river enters the ocean. It's just a celebration, it's a homecoming, this is how it's always been. So to return to where we started, there is nothing that you must do, or I must do, or any of us must do, and there is no effort, or there's no strategies, and there's no cumulative practice for real spiritual attainment. For the simple reason you're there already. And it doesn't seem to matter how many hundreds, thousands of years and scores and hundreds and thousands of teachers say this. You still hear people talking about their spiritual life and how they're meditating now a bit more and having a deeper meditation and, this, that and the other, which sounds like it accrues like you're collecting stamps or trying to read the work of Dickens or something. I mean, it's just absurd. This is your inner state. This is the truth. This is the freedom that you enjoy already if you just stop doing the other things you're doing. So this is why the spiritual practice is stop doing what you're doing. Don't do something to be yourself. Just stop everything you're doing to prevent you being
let's
yourself.
leave it there for today. Again, very
So
quickly, it seems
hence,
like we've come
devotion
to the end
must be
of our
joyful.
time.
The
When we
life
come
of the
together the
devotee,
next
of
time,
course,
we'll
is
begin
genuine.
exploring
Otherwise,
the
it's
next
something
lecture
else.
in the series,
And we
which
must be
is
aware of the
honoring
ego
the date.
gratifications of, happiness or misery.
Good. Thank
The idea of accruing, or for that matter, diminishing ourselves. These are all tricks of the ego.